That's what W.C. Fields always used to say.
Well said.
Huh? Well, Lawrence Welk, yeah, he had a sort of a Swedish way of saying that. Wonderful, wonderful. But you guys don't know who these people are. From another age. Okay. Luke 6, 1 through 11. I think it's such a short passage, and perhaps we could have Jeffrey, our first reader here, just read all 11 verses while we look at it. Okay.
Luke 6, 1 through 11. Now it happened that he was passing through some grain fields on a Sabbath, and his disciples were picking the heads of grain, rubbing them in their hands, and eating the grain. But some of the Pharisees said, "Why do you do what is not lawful on the Sabbath?" And Jesus answering them said, "Have you not even read what David did when he was hungry? He and those who were with him, how he entered the house of God and took and ate the consecrated bread, which is not lawful for any to eat, except the priests alone, and gave it to his companions? And he was saying to them, the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath." On another Sabbath, he entered the synagogue and was teaching. And there was a man there whose right hand was withered. The scribes and the Pharisees were watching him closely to see if he healed on the Sabbath, so that they might find reason to accuse him. But he knew what they were thinking, and he said to the man with the withered hand, "Get up and come forward." And he got up and came forward. And Jesus said to them, "I ask you, is it lawful to do good or to do harm on the Sabbath, to save a life or to destroy it?" After looking around them all, he said to them, "Stretch out your hand." And he did so, and his hand was restored. But they themselves were filled with rage and discussed together what they might do to Jesus.
Okay. We're looking at the Gospel of Luke as he is revealing Jesus to us in a very special way. He's revealing Jesus as a very human person. Jesus calls himself 27 times in this short gospel, or in this long gospel, the Son of Man, because that's his preferred thing. Now, Son of Man has several meanings to it. We'll see it eventually. It has a messianic, clear meaning to it, but it also means I'm a man. And when Jesus went somewhere, in a sense, he was always saying, I'm a man. I'm a man. I'm a man, and I'm Lord of the Sabbath. I want you to see Jesus, the Son of God, Son of Man. This is the revelation that Luke uniquely gives us, and that's why the beginning of it starts with his birth in a humble environment and all of that kind of stuff that the other Gospels don't dwell on very much. You see Jesus as a little boy in the temple and all that. Why? Because he wants you to see Jesus as a human being. The idea is this, because Christians need to understand how human Jesus is. He really understands us. You could take a line right from the Gospel of Luke and go right to Hebrews, because the Jewish Christians in Hebrews had a trouble with seeing Jesus as the man. They saw Jesus as the Christ up in heaven, transcendent. They didn't see the immanent Jesus, their high priest. And the problem with Christians today is we've got Jesus shuffled off into such an area that we don't believe something like this. Jesus is so human that you'll see in the story in the gospel, he needs us. He needs men. He needs companionship. And why is that? Because he's a human. So is there something wrong with that? See, we got an idea that Jesus really didn't need anything. Well, he needed God, but he needed man. He's a human, much more human than you could imagine. That's why he loves so intensely. Do you remember what he said at the Lord's table? Just shooting a couple of anecdotes. You remember what he said? It's only in Luke that he records this. With great desire, I have desired to have this Passover meal with you. He's talking human to human. There's something very touching about that. It's more than just, I'm having the Passover to show you the means of my death and resurrection. Well, that's part of it. There's something deeper. You're going to have to connect with Jesus to understand the Gospel of Luke. But the problem is what? We're usually not lowly enough. And so there's an interesting exegetical position if we want to understand the context of even these stories tonight. You in these stories tonight are the Pharisees. Now you say, no, that's impossible. No, that's exactly what Luke is trying to get at. Until we get out of our religious underwear, we can't enjoy Jesus, we can't love Jesus, we can't fellowship with him. We're too religious. The Pharisees just couldn't strip themselves of all that pretense. of their self-righteous climbing up. That's what the Sabbath is about, I'm better than you because I kept the Sabbath more than you. I just was at a hospital today, and I got in the Sabbath elevator. And it says on the Sabbath, you just step in there because it stops on every floor, up and down, without you pushing the button. God forbid you should push a button and break the Sabbath. There's something a little screwy about that, you see. I don't know. Anyway, there we go. So Jesus came among men to reveal God as Jubilee, to reveal God as grace, to reveal God as joy, and tonight, to reveal God as Shabbat Shalom. Now, in case you don't know that, you cannot go to Jerusalem or Israel and hang around for a couple of days without hearing on a Friday evening, Shabbat Shalom. Shabbat is Sabbath in Hebrew, and Shalom means much more than peace. It means well-being. It means you be blessed. Be blessed in the rest. That's what Jews speak to one another, and whether they're Jewish or not, the person in the hotel said that to me as the evening came on Friday night when I was there a few weeks ago. Shabbat Shalom. And we're going to see that Jesus, the Son of Man, came to really bring Shabbat Shalom. You see, salvation has come to the earth in Jesus, right? The Jubilee is its atmosphere. In Luke chapter 4, verse 17, he says, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me because he's anointed me to preach the gospel to the poor, to heal the brokenhearted, to recover his sight to the blind. And he says, today is the day of Jubilee. That's what it means. This is the acceptable year of the Lord. The Jubilee has begun. That's the wonderful spiritual realm in which Jesus came to earth. I like to look at it like this. I know it's kind of stupid. Wherever Jesus was, there was a 20-foot aura where you got within the zone and you got zapped by the kingdom. You looked at him, you sensed the anointing, you sensed the nearness of the kingdom. As he spoke, the words were more than words. They hammered into your heart with conviction, or they brought joy and hope to you. If he got near enough to you, perhaps you didn't have to touch him, you'd be healed. Because within this radius, there was the Jubilee. Luke points this out and reminds us time and time. The Jubilee, the year the captives are set free, the year the slaves are set free, the years the debts are all paid. This is the year. Grace is the internal awareness of the Jubilee. And that we're to live in that kind of grace where we realize, you know what, I know I'm not worthy, but hey, in the Jubilee, he set me free. And we live in that wonderful grace. Joy, we looked at last week because we saw how much Jesus enjoyed being with the brethren. We saw the joy of the Lord was his strength. Even when he was hassled by people who were eager to oppose him, you couldn't steal his joy. It was irrepressible. And now Shabbat is the time frame in which we experience joy. Now, one of the reasons we have a hard time really tasting grace, tasting joy, tasting Jubilee is we're not in Shabbat. We're busy, busy, busy. I'm late for a very important date, just like that rabbit who had to change.
Yeah.
One of your discussion groups last week had to pull all the fur off of that rabbit. Yeah, we all got that little rabbit in us, And so we'll see that Jesus is going to have to teach us how to live in Sabbath, in rest. That's what Jesus has come to teach man to do, how to live in rest, right? Now, of course, the only way we can really experience Jubilee is by having been faithful in rest, right? There was a rest every seventh day, and a rest every 7 years, and a rest every 7 times 7 years, and that's the Jubilee. So we need to learn this discipline of rest. This is very important in Jesus coming, okay? So tonight we're going to look at the first 2 insights into the Sabbath. There's more to come because the Sabbath controversy comes up in the Gospel of Luke. How many of you think more than 10 times? The Sabbath controversy. How many of you think more than 15 times? How many of you think more than 20 times? Well, good. None of you said there's 17 times. The Pharisees or somebody came and specifically said, you're destroying the Sabbath. And meanwhile, he's bringing people into the Sabbath. This is a certain blindness. Something's wrong. What do you think? Something's wrong when people can't enjoy the Sabbath. Now, there was the Sabbath law, but it become a burden rather than a rest. The Sabbath law was for rest. And no, now it's a burden. And man is zealously trying to observe outwardly the customs as a means of righteousness, and it's lost the original purpose. And you know what else is saddest thing about the Sabbath, the way these Pharisees have defined it? It had tied the Lord's hands. Imagine this guy with a withered hand, and these guys say, you can't heal him on the Sabbath. God won't heal him on the Sabbath. There's something twisted there, you see. And Jesus has to confront these things because he wants to keep the Sabbath holy. So we're going to have to look at what that means. So the first story we have is the story of whether Jesus is the Sabbath breaker or not. This is where the disciples are rubbing grain in the field. And the Pharisees, now it's interesting to me on the Sabbath day that the Pharisees are walking through the field. Now, why are they there? For no other purpose than to observe, to criticize, and to find something against Jesus. That's your job. By the way, I say this just in passing. We received another complaint. Somebody doesn't like our Sabbath. So we're going to have to pray and see what to do. We might have to meet somewhere else. I don't know. Anyway, but you see, I mean, why are the Pharisees fussing? Why would anybody fuss with you guys yesterday? Why Cameron whispering everything he says? Well, maybe we enjoyed ourselves too much, huh? I don't know, but there we go. All right, now let's begin at the beginning here, because Jesus claims that he didn't break any laws, but rather he came to fulfill the laws. And if you turn around that fulfilled, you'll understand what it means. He says, I didn't come to break any laws. I came to fill full the law. I want you to see what the law is like, not just as an outward command, but as an inward reality. Here's the commandment about the Sabbath. Now let me fill it with reality. This is the reality right here. Right? Okay. So we need to note, first of all, from Genesis 2:3, where it all originated, just two things we want to say. Jen, would you just read 2:3 right there?
Genesis 2:3. Then God blessed the seventh day and sanctified it, because in it he rested from all his work which God had created and made.
Okay. The first thing to note on Genesis 2 is it says that God completed his work on the seventh day. Maybe that was verse 2. Who's got Genesis 2:2? Crystal, you got it?
Yeah.
Go.
On the seventh day, God had finished his work of creation.
Okay. Now it says literally in the Hebrew, on the seventh day, and it says, and the seventh day, God finished his work. And as the rest of your sentence said there, what is it?
He finished his work of creation, so he rested from all his work.
Okay. Now think about this. He created something on the seventh day. Now, he created for 6 days. The seventh day, he created something. What did he create? Shabbat. Now, this is part of God's creation, right? Note number 2. That being the case, before the law of Sinai was ever given, Shabbat had been woven into the fabric of creation, even before the law was given. How about that? And there are men who don't know the Jewish laws, men who aren't Christians, but somehow they have found the rhythm of Shabbat. And because of that, they are blessed. It's woven into the very fabric of creation. Something to think about. Yeah, Sammy.
If there's something to that, it's the only day where there was not an evening and morning, meaning that the seventh day is still, the rest period is still not complete.
I think you can make a point of that spiritually. I think obviously
they don't say that.
Yeah, that's it. Very good. It's a very good point. By the way, what was man's first day? Yeah, he was created on the 6th day, so his first full day was, okay, man, here's what I want you to do. Rest. And you know, back before man sinned, he didn't mind it because he understood what Shabbat was. There we go. Now, when we get to the scripture here, there's a little footnote I want to show you regarding It's a matter of textual criticism. You know what that means? That means they take the Greek documents and they try to decide which ones were the originals and all of that. And so the scholars try to do their best job. Anyway, if you'll notice in Luke 6:1 in the King James Version, KJV, right? It says, and it came to pass on the second Sabbath after the first. Huh? What? Who? So most of your translations say, and it came about on the Sabbath, right? Skip, do you have a version that says the second Sabbath after the first?
Yeah.
Huh?
New King James has it.
New King James kept it. Okay. That he went to the cornfields and the disciples plucked the ears of corn and did he rubbing them in their hands. Okay. Now, I want to talk about this. You see, there's this obscure Greek word that is stuck in the Textus Receptus. Now, the Greek text that was used to make the King James Version was called Textus Receptus, a big term for received text. This is the text. Now, make your King James Version. And this Textus Receptus version had this word in it, deuteroprotos, second first. And it came to pass in the second first Sabbath, which had been interpreted by these guys, the second Sabbath after the first. Okay. Later versions of the Greek text, Kurtaland is the main Greek text. I'm not bothered with all this stuff, but in the late 19th century, they came up with a complete newer version, because between 1611 and 1900, there was a lot of new texts found in the Egyptian soil and this and that. And so they compare hundreds and hundreds of texts. And when they find a variation, they try to say, well, which one's the original? The basic theory of textual criticism is this: the shorter version is probably more real. Because if there's a longer version, stuff has been added to it by some monk. You know, everything we have was given to us by monks. You realize that. There was nobody, James the Apostle didn't have a typewriter. It was passed down through a written thing, and the monks copied these things down. And sometimes the monks understood or didn't understand something. And so as an example, Romans 8:1, if you had the King James Version, says,
Therefore now no condemnation to them who are in Christ Jesus, who don't walk after the flesh, but after the Spirit.
who walk not after the flesh, but after the Spirit. That's in Romans 8:1. But when you look at the newer versions, they took out that last section because they said, wait a minute, somebody wanted to emphasize that, which is down in verse 4, and they plugged it again in verse 1. So you see, they have to make these kinds of decisions. Which way is the right way? Which way is the wrong way? Now, although the principle is the shorter is usually the right, there's an exception to that principle, and it happens when the longer phrase is the original. But the monks who were transcribing it, because they didn't understand what it meant, they left it out. So some monk came along and said, and unfortunately, Sinaiticus, Codex Sinaiticus, which is the biggest ancient Greek text we have, doesn't have this deuteroprotos in it. And some monk came, deuteroprotos, Sabbath, sabbatismos, deuteroprotos, sabbatismos, what does that mean? And he cut out the deuteroprotos and just put Sabbath. Well, in either way, it's not going to hurt you an awful lot, but let's understand what it means. Because see, actually, you know what? One thing that's happened, Jewish scholarship has, the church has finally started listening to Jewish scholarship. And when the Jewish rabbis were told, well, there's this ancient text, but we don't believe it's the true one because it says deuteroprotos Sabbath. They said, no, that's we understand that. The second Sabbath after the first. They said, well, what does that mean? They said, it's the Sabbath that comes after the waving of the Feast of First Fruits. So there's the Passover, there's the Feast of Unleavened Bread, and then on the first day of the week after the Passover, on the first day of the week, the priest goes in the temple and he waves the first sheaf like this. And then they start to count 7 Sabbaths, after which time is the Feast of Pentecost. So you've got Passover, the Feast of Unleavened Bread, the Feast of First Wave, the first grain offering, where they wave the fruit, and then they count 7 Sabbaths, and then the Feast of Pentecost, right? That being the case, now you see how beautiful this picture is. When were the disciples walking through the grain fields? was after the Passover and after the sheaf had been waved. And what does that mean? There they are, just rubbing grain and eating and enjoying themselves. Why? Because the first sheaf, not, you know what? While the priest walked into the temple on that first day of the week in 29 AD and brought that first sheaf up like this before God and said, "Oh God, this is the first sheaf and the promise of the full harvest." At that very moment, Jesus was raised from the dead. Jesus was raised from the dead on the feast of the first fruits. Do you know that? Yeah. So this, it means that the disciples picture are walking in resurrection life, receiving God's gracious supply. Freely you've received, freely eat. Wheaties. And they're doing this in the freedom of resurrection life. Well, all right. Now that was a big struggle over textual criticism. But I just want you to understand that textual criticism is a science, and there are many scholars who debate these things all the time, and there's more codices and the scrolls, papyri are unearthed. The debate continues. All right, now there we go. There we go. So the Son of Man, a Sabbath breaker? The issue of the Sabbath, is it law or is it grace? Aha! Interesting, huh? Going back to that original thought in Genesis 2:3, what is the original thought on the Sabbath? God looked over his creation, especially as he's created man and woman, especially when he looked at Eve and he says, very good. Tov, tov. Very good. God, and then it says, God set apart a rest day. Why? Because all the necessary work was finished. Didn't say all the work was finished. But God he created a day of rest for himself. Read it. And God blessed the seventh day and sanctified it, because in it he rested from all his work. God had the rest. Oh, so exhausted. I created Jurassic Park. All of these other things. Well, I did pretty well. But when it came to creating women, I'm just completely exhausted. They're just messing with my mind. They're so emotional. And I got to take a rest. Now, why did God rest? Why did he have to take a rest?
To enjoy it.
Well, first of all, we got to say, well, in the physical sense, he didn't need to take a rest, right? I mean, come on, we're talking like fools, right? He didn't need rest. What was he setting in the creation? Okay, I want 1/7 of creation to be Sabbath. What he did was, and I don't want you to get too spooky and mystical about this, but he set the tempo of the blessed created life for himself and for us to enjoy. There's something about that rest put together with the life of our busy lives that causes us to be able to be blessed, to recreate, to be inspired, to refocus. It enhances life. So not only did he enjoy the rest, but of course man was around there. So he said Adam and Eve. He said, "Uga, uga, aga, uga," which means in the ancient Hebrew, I delight that you enter into my rest. Look over this. Enjoy the tempo of it. Here are the seasons. Here is the life. And God seems to want man to enter into the blessing of what this Sabbath is all about. Now, the issue of the Sabbath, whether the law or is it grace, you see, Sabbath was designed to give man rest, but the Pharisees and those leaders of Judaism had made it a sort of a legal righteousness, something you obtain to by striving. You know, man will make everything striving if he can. And so they strive, and to keep the flesh, man's flesh under control in one day a week. This all was burdensome. And frankly, if you know what Jesus was talking about last week, it's part of the old garment. It's got holes in it. And you can't put a new garment on it or make a patch from a new garment. This old garment is worn out. This world, because of its corruption, is wearing out. This world wears out people. The more intensely people try to grab life, the quicker they get burned out. And you know that's true. We used to talk about, in my generation, people in their early 50s burning out. Now we have people in their mid-30s burning out. They started an intensive course. They stuck with it. They concentrated on a thing. They worked 80 hours a week. And suddenly 35, the body starts to break down and they have mental, and they just kind of explode or get out or something. God never meant for the craziness that's going on today. There was something woven into the very fabric of creation that was called Shabbat, right? All right. But the fall of man caused no rest for the wicked, as it says in the Bible. There's no rest for the wicked. Why? Because man has decided. Why? Why? Because man has decided that he is a God. He is limitless. He doesn't need a day off. If he'll work harder. So a good Chinese merchant understands this. If he works 7 days and the Indians only work 6 days a week, the Chinese guy's going to beat him out. And the IB person realizes if they stay up all night and get on the phone at 4 a.m. to Europe, they're going to get ahead of the people who wait till 9 o'clock in the morning to come into work. Because we all are idolaters, especially the Pharisees and especially us who believe we don't need Shabbat. We cut corners and don't realize what we're cutting is the very depth and inspiration of fabric in our lives. So here's a man, a sinful man, completely out of sync with the rhythm and the cycle of creation. So when God gathered a people together at Sinai, he laid down the law, right? Exodus chapter 20. Let's look at the reason why you have to keep the Sabbath. What does it say, Giovanna? Exodus 20. The 10 Commandments are there in Exodus 20. I thought you all knew that. All right. I know you did. Okay, go. So when we get to the fourth commandment, which is the Sabbath, read the whole thing. Let's see what God says about it.
Okay. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is the Sabbath of the Lord your God. In it you shall do no work, you nor your son, nor your daughter, nor your male servant, nor your female servant, nor your cattle, nor your stranger who is within your gates. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea and all that is in them, and rested the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it.
All right. So God had to make a law because man had fallen. And God's people, he had to give them a law. He said, 6 days you work, 7 days, Shabbat. You must stop. You are a creature. If God stops, you stop. You know, Jesus comes to us as Jesus the man. And one thing you'll notice about Jesus is he kept Shabbat. He knew that rhythm as a man. He knew he was dependent. He knew he was a creature. He knew he was under the favor of God. He knew that he could work 6 days and rest on the Shabbat. Now, it's not really a day thing, literally. But he knew that he could do his work and ministry and leave the rest to God. The point of a Jew even today is when the sun comes down on Friday, he stops working and he's forbidden to worry about it. He is forbidden to ask forgiveness for sins. He is forbidden to repent. It is done. It is done. It is done. All you can do is enjoy what God has done for you. And God blesses people who actually say, I believe God is my provider. Jehovah Jireh, my provider. You see, if you really believe that, God blesses you working good 6 days heartily and just rest. Let everybody jump ahead, try harder, be on top. Well, they may get a little bit richer, but they'll be in a bondage. And all the worse because they think they're God. Meanwhile, you've humbled yourself. And the Jews, because they humbled themselves and observed Shabbat, which is actually one of the main things that Jews do today, even semi-practicing Jews, Shabbat, they take seriously. And that's why they're the richest people in the world. Now, of course, they're also pretty smart, but that's another story. Okay, now, so what we're seeing here is that what God is saying is, why do I want you to rest? Because I created you. I am creator. You are creature. You are creature. And I love you and I will provide for you, but only if you will be a creature. Remember who you are. You're a creature who needs rest. Yes, you is what this commandment says. Otherwise, they would work. The Canaanites work 7 days a week. The Egyptians work 7 days a week. The strangest thing, these Jewish people came into the midst and took over this little land of Palestine and became unbelievably rich. The half has not yet been told. Joy unspeakable and full of glory, full of glory. Oh, that was last week's song. And the half has never yet been told. That's what happened to Solomon because he knew what Shabbat meant. Think about it. So the essence of the gospel is this. God's grace is you rest, I supply. Now, it means you work your butt off 6 days. So don't be a sluggard and think I'm going to bless you. But if you do the work a man's supposed to do, then you can rest in total confidence. And and you take a Shabbat and you say, God's done it. God will do it. I receive it. It's grace. So the very foundation of our gospel is what? Come unto me, all ye that labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. That is the first thing that needs to happen when a human being humbles himself and says, God, I need help. God says, I'm right here. And then you say, okay, God, now that I'm saved, I really want to serve you. What should I do for you? God says, the first thing I'd like you to do is Shabbat. No. I mean, what do you want me to do? Shabbat. So that's right. So Elijah, just like the Apostle Paul, when the Apostle Paul got saved, he says, I want to go preach. I want to go witness. I want to travel the world. God says, great. Shabbat in the desert for 3 years. Now, out there in the desert with a couple of sheep and a goat, you got plenty of time to Shabbat. And he needed Shabbat in his life because during that time in your life, you know what Shabbat does to the person who observes it? If you get into that rhythm of creation's Shabbat, here's what happens. That's when you write songs. That's when you write poetry. That's when your spiritual life goes deeper. That's where you have conversations with God. That's where you think and reflect on creation, your creator. It's amazing the things that can happen in our lives by way of inspiration if we only took the time. I'm so thankful every time somebody comes in and makes another little castle with the turrets because somebody had the rest to do that. So thankful that our dear absentee Abe yesterday could give us that little blues wonderful hymn. He had the rest. You say it's a waste of time. You know how my whole music ministry started? Well, here's the deal. Because I was a charismaniac, I got kicked out of the Baptist church. And so Julie and I moved with our 3 kids into my mother and father's house. And we lived upstairs, they lived downstairs. And I drove a school bus. 7 o'clock in the morning, drive the school bus, take the kids to school, go back home. 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock, 12 o'clock, 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock. 3 o'clock, pick them back up. $65 a week, all the kids I could eat. That was my job. Well, I had nothing to do between 10 and 2. So I went down in the basement with my guitar, put new strings on it, and started reading the hymns and reading the scriptures. I think the first one I sang was, I looked up and I saw God sitting on a throne, from Revelations 5. I wrote that down in the basement one day, just goofing around down there. A waste of time. I was a total waste of time. You know, God gives us Shabbat. And Shabbat is when creation happens. Well, there you go. Okay. But you have to remember to keep it holy. Interesting. Remember, it's sort of like the Lord's table, isn't it? You got to remember. Keep it holy, he says. Acknowledge your creator, right? All right. By the way, family life, married life, single life, the depth of life becomes shalom, healthy, when you observe Shabbat. I can't make it any plainer than that. Now, in the particular controversy, they asked him why his disciples broke the Sabbath, and he answered them by citing the example of David, who, when he was hungry, took the bread off the altar of the tabernacle, the showbread. As you can see, David there with those big loaves. That's what the showbread was like, big things like that. And he took all 12 of them and gave them to his men who were running away from King Saul with him. And Jesus said, if David could do that, then we can do this with the grain in the field. And all, see, because what Jesus said to them is, have ye not read? Now, wait a minute. One thing about the Pharisees is they've read the whole Bible, Old Testament backwards and forwards. Had they not read? Of course they read, but they hadn't read. They read, but they hadn't read. They'd seen, but they'd never seen. Until Jesus said, oh, well, David did that. And God said that was okay. Now, he was talking a lot more about David. David knew grace in a remarkable way, as we know from reading the Psalms. He understood. The bread of the presence, those loaves of bread, meant that the children of Israel were always before the face of God. That's what the bread of the presence meant. The bread of the presence, actually, in the Greek, in the Hebrew, is lechem, which is bread, and panim, which is face. The bread of his face. That's what the showbread is, literally. In other words, that bread's always before God's face. He's looking at the children of Israel, all 12 tribes. And David felt that God was looking over him, and he could take that bread and by the grace of God use it to nourish his body and those who were running away with him. And by the way, it's got an interesting layer there that you see. David had been anointed king, but he was not yet recognized as king, and he was actually on his way as a fugitive, not recognized yet. And Jesus was also anointed as the Messiah, but not yet recognized. And he was in need of some food. Why did they eat in the field? Because they were hungry. Humans get hungry, right? As you could see back there at the slopping board back there tonight, a lot of people hungry, eating away. It's a very human thing, right? Okay. And then the punchline comes, of course, when Jesus says unto them, the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. Woo! Now listen, that means that the main point he was making to these Pharisees is, I am the Lord of the Sabbath. Wow. I mean, that's pretty clear. He is challenging them, right? Now, the same story given in Matthew chapter 12, verse 5, says this. He adds something to this, which is not in Luke. He adds another reason why they could take the bread. He says, or have you not read the law that on the Sabbath, the priests of the temple break the Sabbath and are innocent? And then he says, but I say unto you that something greater than the temple is here. The Son of Man is here. There's something greater going on here than the temple where there's some bread, right? And then he goes on in Matthew and says, but if you had known what this means, I desire compassion, not sacrifice, you would have not condemned the innocent, for the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. And what is he saying? To God, in terms of the Sabbath, mercy is more important than punctilious outward obedience, right? Mercy is greater and more important than ceremony. Well, there we go. Now, so Jesus came as Lord of the Sabbath, not a Sabbath breaker, but a Sabbath maker, to bring people into the reality of this new garment, of the new wine, of the new Sabbath, a Sabbath that is rest. And he declares himself the one who rules over the Sabbath. Something greater than the temple is here. He acknowledges his authority. He is the Lord of the Sabbath, so he can make exceptions. He doesn't abrogate the Sabbath. He doesn't throw the Sabbath away. He just says, I'm the Lord of the Sabbath, and I can make whatever exceptions need to be made for the sake of mercy. If these guys are hungry, there's no time to say they can't do this because of the Sabbath. You see? And Mark, in his version of the same story, he goes on and gives this wonderful insight that makes it a more universal principle. He says, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. The Sabbath was made to be a blessing to man, even as Jesus was a man and rested in this wonderful grace of God. So the outstanding questions are two. One, who is this who claims to be Lord of Shabbat? I mean, imagine some guy coming on the scene. He's not a high priest. He's not a Pharisee. He comes and says, no, I'm the Lord of the Sabbath. I'm taking it back. You guys have messed it up. You've made the Sabbath a burden. I'm taking it back. And I, the Lord of the Sabbath, declare that there's freedom to do this and that. Wow. The second question is, am I living in Shabbat? In God's intended Shabbat rest for man. Am I? Are you? Am I? Or are we Pharisees? Well, I won't stay there. All right. Just Abraham Heschel. Anybody know who that is? As I thought. All right. Well, Abraham Heschel is a Jewish philosopher. And he has much to say on the Sabbath. And he's a very wonderful brother. Interesting man. Even in regards to Yeshua HaMashiach, he is not altogether against the idea of Jesus being the Messiah. But anyway, that being said, let's see, who can read this good here? All right, Kathleen, our cook extraordinaire tonight. Yeah, read this in the philosophical tones of Abraham Heschel. A little Russian, little Jewish accent. Okay.
The meaning of the Sabbath is to celebrate time rather than space. 6 days a week, we live under the tyranny of things of space. On the Sabbath, we try to become in tune to holiness and time. It is a day on which we are called upon to share in what is eternal in time, to turn from the results of creation to the mystery of creation, from the world of creation to the creation of the world.
There you go. Who does that anymore? Who reads anymore? Who contemplates? Who thinks anymore? Blessed is the man who takes time to think about the Creator and his creation. Okay? Then the second episode, we know this Shabbat Shalom, this well-being of God that came upon this man with the withered hand. And it says, on another Sabbath, he entered the synagogue and was teaching, and there was a man there whose right hand was withered. Now here's a picture of a man needing grace. He could not rub the grain because of his withered hand. He was a specimen of the impotence of Jerusalem, of the whole system of the Pharisees, with a form of godliness that had no power. This guy was in the synagogue. He was hungry to know God and his word and everything. But the regulations had bound God's hands behind his back, and this man with a withered hand could not be healed any day of the week by the Pharisees. But they used the excuse, you cannot heal him on the Sabbath. So there again, the Pharisees stand directly against Jesus. Jesus, it says he knows what they're thinking. And they're looking to get him in some way, right? So Jesus calls this man into the midst to demonstrate before all. What was he demonstrating before everybody? God's right in Sabbath mercy, right? Here's just some of the details of the story from the three different sources, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. In Matthew 12:9, this turns out to be the same Sabbath as the wheat fields. Because if you read 12:9, it says, departing from there, meaning from the fields, he went into their synagogue. So it was the same day. There's a second event that happened on the same Sabbath. Luke 6, being a doctor, Luke notices that the right hand was withered. Matthew, Mark don't say anything about that. The Pharisees put the question to him in Matthew 10. In Luke 6:8, Jesus knew what they were thinking and brought it out. Matthew 12:11, Jesus asks about the sheep in a ditch, which only comes in Matthew. And basically he says, hey, look, if your sheep's in a ditch on the Sabbath, would you pull them out? Or in other words, on the Sabbath, do you have a right to do good or evil? To gain life or destroy life. That's how foolish that whole Sabbath system had become. That the Pharisees would actually have to answer to be consistent. We are for the destruction of life. We are for evil, not good. Because God doesn't want you to heal. So Jesus says, is it lawful to do good and save life on the Sabbath? And in Mark 3, it has this beautiful picture of Jesus looking around and becoming angry because of the hard hearts of the people. And what does that mean? Not only the Pharisees were sitting there and nobody budging or moving, but the other people in the synagogue had been forced, intimidated into a silence where they didn't say anything either. Jesus got angry, that kind of hard-heartedness. Here's a man in need, a man who can't rub grain. And what are you saying on the Sabbath? God's hands are tied? Not a bit of it. He says, stretch forth your hand. And that man does the one impossible thing. By faith, of course, you can tell the guy, stretch your foot out. He can do anything except stretch forth a withered hand. But what was it that he believed that enabled him to stretch forth the hand? He obeyed the word of Jesus. That's faith. Jesus spoke, and he stuck out impossibly his right hand, and that hand was healed. A wonderful picture, wonderful story. And the healing of the man with the withered hand brought the Sabbath home to all the people in that synagogue. And what did the Sabbath mean? The Sabbath is kept holy when God, the Creator, is honored in what is done, when he can bring his creation into shalom. Shalom is a word for healing as well as well-being. And God, his Sabbath is for shalom. Shabbat shalom. And so the scribes and the Pharisees, of course, it says, were filled with rage because these things of the kingdom are brand new and they prefer the old garment and the old wine and the old Sabbath. And Jesus is coming in with a whole kingdom, which is definitely different than their. And so there is a breach that you see between them. Now, there's a second reason why we need to observe the Sabbath. The first one was in Exodus 20. Now, in Deuteronomy chapter 5, once again, it talks about it's the same Ten Commandments. You know, Deuteronomy 5, it's given a second time. Deuteronomos means second law. And in 5:15, the Ten Commandments are recited, and it says, and you shall keep the Sabbath holy, and you should do no work, nor the people in your service and your servants and all this stuff. Because you shall remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God brought you out of there by a mighty hand and by an outstretched arm. Therefore, the Lord your God commanded you to observe the Sabbath day. Now, there's a whole second reason why we need to observe the Sabbath day. And what does the Sabbath day mean now? It's to be observed in light of redemption. The first aspect was to be observed in light of creation. Now, the second aspect of Sabbath is to bring people into shalom. It's the redemptive side. God has saved his people. It is his Sabbath work to save people. Jesus came to say, this is the Sabbath work, to bring healing and shalom to a man with a withered hand. And he does it time after time after time. And the Pharisees get so mad and they look how to destroy this man. Bringing Shabbat shalom to man and salvation and healing keeps the Sabbath holy. Now we observe Sabbath. Do we heal the broken? Do we bring the gospel of shalom? This is what God works on the Sabbath. Jesus says, God works and I work on the Sabbath. And what am I working to do? When did Jesus say that? God is working, so I'm working. When they challenged it because it was the Sabbath day. Anybody remember what he was doing at that time? It's in the Gospel of John. What is it? Well, it was there during his 3.5 years of ministry. Remember the event? When he met the man by the pool and he said, pick up the bed and go home. Everybody said, you can't do that. It's the Sabbath. He says, what are you talking about? It is the Sabbath, but I watch my God. And when my God is working, I'm working. If he says shalom on that man, I say shalom on that man. And that man got up and walked. That's what we do on the Sabbath, right? Is that what we do on Shabbat? We so overflow and rest that the shalom comes upon other people. All right, praise God. All right, now tonight, break up into 4 groups. I've got a couple of quotes for you to look at and discuss for a couple of minutes, and then we'll come back together for just a minute at the end. All right, 4 groups. These 4 right here are the 4 leaders. Right? So here we go. 1 group back there at the table. There's just 4 copies. Special question. Jeff can take a group right over there, and then there's a group here, this is group 2, and then group 3 right there. Just, yeah, try to break up kind of evenly here. It should be about, it's like about 5 or 6 in a group. 5 or 6 in a group. Let me go back to the table back there. Not enough table potatoes. These are all quotes regarding Shabbat.
But for discussion, when your tongue is silent, when your imagination is silent, I'm gonna read this to myself.
What do you guys have, a long one? Which one? How's it start? This is it? This one?
No, G, what do you got?
Well, I think, oh gosh. I think it's first. I don't know, I can only put it in when you really listen to the board. I think like, so, first laws, in a time of seeing it's like, the laws that are like, I don't know how to do it, like, no, it's not actually. And then when job, yeah. And you think these guys, sounds so simple. Yeah. That's all I got. It's a little bit red.
I'm not already in the book, but they do like studies saying that.
No, you're playing that.
I don't know, at least for me, I guess I would look at like boundaries, like it's not just like time, you know, it's like it is like when you're not capable of. I need like especially the only time that I feel I've ever really powerful and well, I shouldn't say that, but the deepest time you have enough time to get
I think that's like the powerful is like what you would assume the vote to be is that when you take on and like he is in the room and if he's from his activities, that's like power in like spirit. Right? But then like the reason why the vote is powerful is it adds in and limit. Because I think we're always obsessed with that. We have that freedom of nature, so it's like over there. It's like when we have that freedom of word, we just you know feel like that's
How do you find out?
It's not like, even like a side chart, quite a side street.
I
I know my house, the little stars, down the street from where I work. You guys all have seen it.
But it is also like a work
It's a very quiet range back. So they're doing construction.
you could just determine every, like, everybody just determine their own day. But we're limited, each person is limited by the God gives us. I don't know.
Yeah. Like, really doing it. Yeah, you're right. I have so many interests in like, right, all of them. Like, I don't know what it's like, I'm gonna do this, I'm gonna create this, I'm gonna do this. It's like, not really, so this story, my own capability, following or whatever.
It takes effort to like go to the park and
I don't think he makes an argument.
then when you say
And if he makes an analogy, like
anyone else, not just that, but too much police.
it's like our body, our space, like I like doing things like creativity concepts. Like you guys meant.
There's many natures of nature.
Or like
Or
your
I
emotions.
think nature is God in so many ways.
Yeah. No, it's so hard to like push yourself out of it. Like just like to have an inspiration.
It opens up the door to God, the large parts of God. And then through that,
Drawing or whatever, like, random stuff, but like, so much like I use my imagination to create
sometimes
something.
nature actually
I kind of like felt like,
so
like, wow, my
it just shuts your head off. I mean, it's basically like, I'm too beautiful, I'm so nice right now, too.
you hear about it, people are like struggling to make it, but then it's from
I
their
feel too good, but it's my days. That it completely takes your mind off everything. Because it's so. If you're looking at it, are you really thinking about like,
waiting on it. Sometimes I feel like when I go like when I go to my Sundays, okay, I have such a plan, it's so planned out that it's like I'm not actually getting rest. Like, this one is sleep, and it's sleep for this period of time, but then it's so stressful, like it's stressed out, like that I'm not doing like more, or it's like I'm not doing enough. So it's like those moments where I just like don't make any plans. I feel like I actually. Like is the body like just they're around beyond like
Me
too, actually. Do a very good job.
That type of
All right, everybody. Let's come back around here. Back to reality. Out of soul and spirit, back to the body. Come on. Let's go, couch potatoes. Turn around here.
Like, yeah. I didn't notice it.
All right, table backsliders. Coming around. Backsliders. Oh, Josh was preaching that back there, huh? All right. All right, I think they had this first quote here, which we'll just read, and there's much to philosophy. This is Abraham Heschel again. There's much that philosophy could learn from the Bible. To the philosopher, the idea of summum bonum is the most exalted idea. But to the Bible, the idea of the good is penultimate. It cannot exist without the holy. The good is the base, the holy is the summit. Things created in 6 days he considered good. The seventh day he made holy. With our bodies, we belong to space. Our spirit, our souls soar to eternity, aspire to the holy. The Sabbath is an ascent to the summit. It gives us the opportunity to sanctify time, to raise the good to the level of the holy, to behold the holy by abstaining from profanity. And profanity does not mean cursing, it just means the common. So to keep the Sabbath holy is to live a life in that period of time above just the things of this earth and appreciate that. Did you guys back at the table have any one sentence statement to make about this? I know, but previous guys. Did you guys have anything to say about Abraham Heschel?
We mentioned that there was an elevation from goodness to holiness. So it's through the Sabbath, the rest, we may enter the next level of our spiritual rest.
Yeah. So you see, you know what that's based on. It's based on God, who says he created the stars and the moon. He says it's good. Then he created Adam and Eve. That's very good. All of the creation is good, but the Sabbath is what makes it holy. So he made the Sabbath, the seventh day, holy. He set it apart. And so the difference between good, even very good among men, is turned into that which is holy and above at the Sabbath. Okay, then there's this simple one, very simple. A being is free only when it can determine and limit its activity. If you're somebody who can't say no, and you're running around like a chicken with your head cut off, and you're trying to do this and trying to do that, trying to do this, trying to do that, because you like to do this, you like to do that, and you have to do this, you have to do that, and you got no time, and you're running around and running around and running around, you're a Sabbath breaker. There's no way. Unless you lay hold and determine and limit your activity, there's no way that you can rest. Resting is eliminating things unnecessary, or not even unnecessary, just eliminating things for the sake of more profoundly coming into that which you should do. And when you're young, when your age, it's that elimination of all the choices and things I could do and this and that. You need to close some of those doors yourself in order to truly find what you're supposed to do. That was your group right here?
Yes.
You guys have any pearls of wisdom about that?
Yeah, so we basically said that like the power of the phrase is in the two words "and limit," because if you just read it without those, it's like kind of our American culture to be like, you're free only when you can determine things. But then we brought up into the concept of like, that limit is what's surprising about the quote, is that we're free also when we can set limits.
All right, and it sounds amazing, profound, just with Jeremy's voice. Can you follow it up by telling us who Karl Barth is? Anybody know? Karl Barth broke on the scene after the First World War as a Lutheran theologian in Switzerland, where he presented what they called a neo-Orthodox theology based on the grace of God and the Word of God. Very, very wonderful man. Stood against the whole Nazi thing in its heyday, and was a friend of Bonhoeffer, by the way. Okay, third quote. Jubilee is the accumulated freedom derived from being faithful to Sabbaths. As C.S. Lewis once said, it comes the very moment you wake up each morning. All your wishes and hopes for the day rush at you like wild animals. And the first job each morning consists simply in shoving them all back and listening to that other voice, taking that other point of view, letting that other larger, stronger, quieter life come flowing in. And so on all day, standing back from all your natural fussings and frettings, coming in out of the wind. And he's talking about how he found time to write. it involved this practice. Somebody have a statement on this? So what group had this one? Moving right along, number 4. Thomas Merton. Anyone know who that is?
Yeah.
Uh,
From the Puritan devotional. Is he the Puritan devotional? Or maybe I'm thinking of something else. Sorry.
He was probably mentioned in the Foster devotion. He was a famous Trappist Catholic monk. I met him in Louisville, Kentucky, in the late 1960s. They took vows of silence. He was a worldwide speaker who got soundly saved by Jesus Christ when he was a businessman in the middle of his life. He says, when your tongue is silent, oh, silent tongue, you can rest in the silence of the forest. When your imagination is silent, all that runaway thinking, the forest speaks to you. It tells you of its unreality and of the reality of God. But when your mind is silent, then the forest suddenly becomes magnificently real and blazes transparently with the reality of God. Ah, yes. All right, and some pearls of wisdom from the couch potatoes.
Yeah, we were just talking about when you cease striving and you strive to, and actually when you make the effort to enter into God's rest and quiet your mind, you're actually not imposing anything on Him. You're allowing Him to speak to you, and then God, the reality of God is overwhelming at that point once you shut yourself off.
If we shut ourselves off in Shabbat, God's reality can be overwhelming. Praise God. A good thought to end on. Next week, we take up the Son of Man lays the kingdom foundation, as you'll see next week. Father, we thank you so much that you called us into a rest. And we found that rest when we came to Jesus. But now, Lord, strip away from us the Pharisee that enjoys things of this world more than the rest, that actually believes they're more important, of higher priority. Lord, help us to come back to an understanding of life and its true rhythm and blessing and recreation and inspiration and all that you intend for us to be, as wise as the Jews who are resting with their children on the Sabbath and being filled with thoughts of wisdom and life. Give us wisdom and life beyond that, for our life indeed is hid in Christ. Help us to rest and to present the shalom to the world around us. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Glad to have Josh and Beryl and their kids helping me with my song here. And wow.